Hello and welcome back. This month for my Catching Up on the Classics video, I read The Picture of Dorian Gray. In my Catching Up on the Classics videos, I tend to either reread books that I haven't read since like middle school or high school, or read books for the first time that are often read in like formal English classes. The Picture of Dorian Gray is one that I had not read before, and it's one that I've been wanting to read for some time, so I was really excited to get a chance to do that. The Picture of Dorian Gray is usually classified as a Gothic novel, and that makes sense because it has many of the qualities that tend to define that genre. Like books such as Dracula, Frankenstein, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it takes place in an urban setting in contemporary society of the time and explores the lives of people who would be ordinary if it wasn't for this strange, weird, wrong thing that's going on. It's not horror in the sense of like a modern horror movie where there's like stuff jumping out at you to scare you or anything like that, or even in the way that the novel Dracula is. There's really nothing all that scary about The Picture of Dorian Gray. However, it definitely is creepy and it definitely is unsettling, and definitely has the sense of like something is not right here, which tends to run throughout Gothic literature. The writing style is very much what you would expect of a 19th century novel, which makes sense because it was written in the late 19th century. I've always felt like that style of writing is a little bit of an acquired taste, and sometimes when I've been away from it for a bit, I have to reacquire it. One thing that I've noticed about a lot of 19th century literature that's definitely the case for The Picture of Dorian Gray is that it has a much more formal writing style than you would expect from modern popular fiction, and also is much more slow-moving and character-driven. There's actually not a whole lot in the way of plot. Like, okay, so he makes the wish at the beginning that he would give up his soul in order to always look like that portrait. And then by the end, he still looks like that portrait, but the portrait has turned hideous. And there are certain things that happen along the way. But as far as like a tightly woven plot where every action or description or dialogue or whatever contributes to that plot, it's more of a character arc featuring Dorian Gray's corruption. I mean, there definitely are events, like for instance, the deaths of Sybil Vane and Basil Hallward, and what happens when Sybil's brother James shows up. But ultimately, the plot is much less significant than the internal journey of the protagonist. As far as that internal journey goes, I thought it was really interesting. I mean, it's a little bit unsettling to start off with a character who's very naive and innocent, and end with a character who's just totally a terrible person, and to watch them develop from one into the other over the course of the novel. It reads very much like a tragedy in that sense. Like, and by that I don't mean just like a story with a tragic ending, but like old tragedies like Shakespeare or ancient Greek tragedy or whatever, like where you have a character with a fatal flaw who, you know, starts off in a position of like everything is going great, and then by the end everything is terrible because of the poor choices that they make because of that fatal flaw. In Dorian Gray's case, I would say that that would be his pride and his vanity. He's compared early on to Narcissus, who's a character from Greek mythology who falls in love with his own reflection. And that's very much what Dorian Gray does. He admires his portrait so much that he wants to never change from the way that he looks in it. And because of that, it leads to all these things happening. Like, that's the first domino to tip over. So in many ways, I think that it was a very well-told story. However, there is one big problem that I had with the writing, and that was the dialogue. I'm not sure, because this is the first work by Oscar Wilde that I've read, I'm not sure if this is just typical of his work, but I found it to be annoying that there was so much dialogue in cases where I felt like it wasn't really necessary. Like sometimes when Henry was just rambling about his ideas, and his ideas of course are what corrupts Dorian, or at least what puts him on that path, so they're important, but sometimes he just goes on forever about them, and it's just like, well, you get to the point. Or like in modern books, sometimes you'll see authors like put a couple of lines of dialogue and then say, and he continued talking along those lines for however long or whatever. Like it wouldn't be worded that way in the novel, but something to that effect. And then, like at the various social events that they attend where there's these long stretches of just very minor characters talking about very minor things that don't really have any relevance. Like, I am all for dialogue when it suits the plot and when it tells you more about the characters and, you know, whatever purpose it might have, but sometimes it did feel like there wasn't really a purpose to all the dialogue, and in those cases, I would have much rather it been, like, just a mention that lots of small talk happened, as opposed to reading all of the small talk. Another thing that I found a little bit unsettling was the thing with the portrait being ugly because Dorian was evil. Now, okay, so there are two things going on here, and I'm okay with both of them independently. Dorian wished that he would always stay young and handsome, and therefore the portrait is aging in his place. That I'm cool with. Everybody ages, that's normal. The portrait is aging because Dorian wished that he wouldn't. The portrait is also supposed to represent like a physical manifestation of the corruption in his soul, and it becomes ugly because he is ugly on the inside even though he looks handsome. I'm okay with that too. I mean, the whole idea of beauty is only skin deep, that's great. Let's explore that. What really bothered me though was that it's implied that he would look like the portrait if he hadn't made the wish, not just in terms of having aged, but in terms of having become ugly. And that implies that being conventionally attractive comes from being a good person, and that being ugly comes from being a bad person, that the way that we look reflects our moral character rather than our genetics or what people find to be attractive in a particular time and place, or whatever the various factors are that contribute to that. And I did do a little bit of research on this as I was preparing for this video, and I did find that that was a very common attitude that people had in the 19th century. I just don't like it. I get it. I just don't like it. Let's see, what else is there to talk about with this one? Well, one thing that I noticed that I was like, okay, so is this intentional? Like, this has got to be intentional, right? I was pretty convinced early on in reading the book that the character Basil Hallward, who painted the portrait, was intended to have romantic feelings for Dorian Gray. Now, it's not outright sad, and it wouldn't be because this was, again, written in the Victorian era. But the way that his feelings are described in terms of, like, being obsessed with him and viewing him as, like, a muse and an inspiration, and, like, he's put too much of his soul into the portrait, and therefore he wouldn't be able to display it anywhere because people might look at it and see how he thinks about Dorian. Like, that just felt very much like it was implying something that couldn't be said outright. And I think there's some implications of that later on as well. And so I did some research on that because I was just curious as to, like, is that just me or do other people see that too? And it turns out, no, it's not just me. When Oscar Wilde was put on trial for homosexuality, they actually read sections of this novel in the courtroom as evidence for the prosecution. So, you know, it seems like it's been pretty obvious to everybody from the beginning. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the Picture of Dorian Gray. Overall, I thought it was a very interesting premise and a very compelling character corruption arc, but I did have a few minor problems with, first of all, the dialogue just being a little bit much sometimes, and then also the portrait and the implication that ugliness is directly correlated to evil. I hope that you enjoyed this and found it to be interesting. If you liked it and you want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday.